Thank you for joining us. We're here today with Dr. Omid Fotui and Dr. Nicole Barbero to talk about the scientific basis that can shed light on why students do or don't engage, and to learn about the strategies that everyone can employ to help sustain motivation and thrive in competitive domains. Dr. Omid Fotui is a motivation and performance researcher and a nationally recognized speaker. He has more than 15 years of experience in training students, athletes, and leaders to optimize their performance. Dr. Barbero is a psychologist with expertise in human evolution, behavior genetics, human development, and higher education. She's committed to increasing public scientific literacy via science communication and promoting positive student outcomes in higher education. The focus of education has traditionally been on providing students with the cognitive skills required to allow for mastery of core academic subjects. This approach has shaped the way we have come to view success in school and how we define an effective leader. Increasingly, education research is demonstrating the value of non-cognitive factors in student success. Today we'll be talking about adaptive mindsets. Omid, would you like to start us off?
Sure. It's great to be here with both of you. I'm excited about our conversation around this important topic that I think there's a lot of questions around. When we think about education, the traditional view is thinking about how do we get students to master content. That's kind of how we approach our classroom practices. It's how we allocate resources. It's how we think about learning as this cognitive process. What we've learned from social psychology primarily is that learning actually is more of a social experience, that people come to see themselves as learners or not. And so because of this identity component to learning, there's also a lot of psychology around what allows people to internalize that identity of a learner and potentially not. So when we're talking about the psychology, first let's take a step back, if we will. Why do we care about psychology in education? Again, as I mentioned, the traditional view is that learning is this content mastery thing. But increasingly, the data is showing that these non-cognitive factors, these psychological experiences, do predict whether students do engage and how well they perform and how much they see themselves as adaptive learners. And so when we recognize these predictive values of the psychology of the students in terms of how they see themselves as learners, we also recognize there's an opportunity for creating programming or interventions or initiatives that foster more of these adaptive mindsets or these adaptive psychological experiences for students to really be able to accept and see themselves as learners. That's the core of what a lot of the research that I reflect on and try to represent is understanding what are these psychological experiences that from the student's perspective allows them to see themselves as learners or not.
So is that how you would define mindset? Or explain to us, how you define mindset. You've done a lot of work in that space. So
mindset is a great term because it captures a lot of things. Essentially, mindset, if you were to define it, I would define it as the core of assumptions that we have for why things happen in our lives. So it's the beliefs and the attributions around the meaning of the events that happen in a day-to-day basis. So that's what typically mindset represents and is defined as. It's important to recognize that most of us in this room know the work by Carol Dweck on growth mindset, which we can talk about, which specifically looks at one specific set of beliefs around the perceptions of the quality of intelligence. So is intelligence something that's malleable or fixed? And that work demonstrates that indeed the way that you view intelligence actually also has these long-term predictive outcomes. But more broadly, if you take a step back and look at the core beliefs and assumptions that we have around why many things happen, then you're able to take a more comprehensive understanding and approach to figuring out how we can cultivate these psychological experiences that fosters better learning.
Yeah. And I was wondering too, how can we foster these different mindsets, or how can we apply mindset in the classroom for students to help with engagement? Because as an educator, we know that engagement's really important for students to be able to engage with that content, learn that content better, which ties into those content goals, but it also makes it a more interactive experience in the classroom. And that engaged learning has been shown in countless studies now that engaged learning is a really effective way for students to succeed in the classroom and in a university context. So how can we use mindsets to kind of foster engagement in the classroom specifically within that space?
That's a wonderful question, and I wish that we can have practitioners, educators, reflect on that question a little bit more, because ultimately the mindset is the precursor for the outcome that you just mentioned, engagement. Ultimately, we all can sort of agree that we want to optimize and increase engagement among our students, but how do you do that? And typically, again, there's sometimes a focus on creating the right resources or the right content. But once you recognize that a lot of engagement has to do with mindset, and specifically the things that cause disengagement. And so from a sort of a basic needs perspective, we all as humans are designed, have evolved to become very good at defending our sense of self-view. And anytime we feel like one of our identities, one of our sort of evaluation dimensions will not be positively viewed, then we're motivated to protect ourselves. And how do we protect ourselves? We run away from things. We sort of distance ourselves from things that could be hard, where we might sort of get negative feedback, where we might be seen in a negative light. And because of this core fundamental need for social inclusion, we're very vigilant and sensitive to things that might cast us in a negative light. What's interesting, I think, is when you think of our educational system as a whole, it's actually almost structured to arouse that sense of threat, right? Like we place students in a classroom for long periods of time, for many years, where we sort of bombard them with content and tell them what to think and when to sort of, come up for testing and what exactly the right answer is, and constantly are giving them negative feedback, yet at the same time expect that they'll be happy in that state, right? Yeah. But at the core of it, we have this mechanism to defend our sense of self-view, which causes disengagement. So when you recognize that sensitivity, and you're trying to cultivate a classroom practice that is conducive to engagement, it helps to recognize the things that arouse disengagement. And when you are aware and vigilant of those things, then you can make sure to minimize the chances that these defense mechanisms come online.
It's a really excellent point that you bring up with trying to promote engagement versus trying to avoid students avoiding engagement. One thing that I've noticed in the classroom is, students asking questions. If you've ever been in a classroom or noticed as a student or an instructor, you see that there's always the same few people asking questions. And I think a lot of it comes down to partly these mindsets ideas, and especially the sensitivity to negative feedback. So our education system is kind of designed around promoting correct versus incorrect answers. So when students ask a question, they may have some anxiety over, well, what if the answer is wrong? And I can look back on my time as a student early on in my undergraduate career, like I would avoid asking questions because you're scared to get that question wrong, especially if you're in a lecture hall with more than 100 students. It's, really, as you mentioned, we're very sensitive to that social feedback and that judgment, especially from our peers in that kind of high stakes context in the classroom. So one thing I think is important is while we're trying to help students foster these mindset skills, we also have to help educators foster a classroom in which we're not only rewarding or punishing the correct answer, and we're rewarding students for asking a question in the first place. So one thing that I've always tried to do as an educator when I'm in the classroom and I'm asking students to ask questions and get engaged is I always provide reinforcement for just answering or asking a question in the first place. So you ever want to start with, no, that's not the right answer. You want to promote that environment where students are happy to ask a question, where they are rewarded for asking a question, being curious. And I think it's a big idea that we need to kind of focus on fostering that curiosity to kind of change those incentive structures for students around just the right answer and fostering an environment where students are curious and they're rewarded for that curiosity, whether or not it's the right answer or not. And then that can kind of get them more confident in the classroom and be more likely to perceive positive outcomes in the classroom rather than just the negative social evaluative outcomes.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think what you're touching on is also at the core of a lot of the work that our training and our research shows, which has to do with the fact that, again, we're meaning-making machines, that we go through our day-to-day lives trying to disambiguate commonly ambiguous situations. That you and I will be sitting here, for instance, and I'm trying to figure out what you're thinking, and you're trying to figure out what I'm thinking. And we rely on incomplete information to fill in the gaps. A student who goes to college, who comes from a high school that's relatively well supportive, they come from a family that's always there and engaged, they have a close-knit group of friends, and all of a sudden finds themselves in these large lecture classes with no friends, and the instructor is not as engaging and supportive because they have larger classes, is left trying to figure out, what does this mean? And what's really at the core of the adaptive mindset skills training is figuring out two things. One is, what are the questions that people ask? And then what are the answers that they come up with to answer those questions? And what's really important to highlight is that both the questions and the answers are important. Now, the questions are sometimes the questions that are, that are things that come to mind because of the normative perceptions that are given to us. So stereotype spread. It's a great phenomenon that tells us that there are these general stereotypes about one's group, that you will believe yourself to be viewed in a certain way. And so absent any other explanation, and because we're sort of motivated to defend ourselves, when there's ambiguity in the context, when there's ambiguity in our interactions, we're actually more likely to make negative attributions for why things are happening. Now, the other thing that's important to clarify is that when things are going well, none of this work matters. You know, like when you're getting a good grade, everyone's supportive, and everything's falling into place, everything's fine and dandy. But when it matters, when the ambiguity comes online, and there's a room for flexibility of how you fill in the meaning of that ambiguity, it's usually in the face of challenge and difficulty. And so if I'm a first-generation student, for instance, I've never had the kind of supports and the structures to tell me how to study effectively or what even failure is supposed to mean to me. And I'm placed in contexts where for the first time I'm exposed to difficult content and I'm getting negative feedback. I might be more likely to attribute internal and fixed sort of explanations for why that's happening. So I might think it's because I'm dumb and that'll never change. So the adaptive mindset sort of skills training program, what it tries to do is to identify the core set of maladaptive questions that people ask in the face of ambiguity and difficulty. So if you can offset and identify and forecast when those negative questions might be posed, for instance, you mentioned trying to create a classroom culture where you're able to allow a student to make the more adaptive attributions about what their identity is seen like. So you want to encourage them and reassure them that their question is valid, that their thoughts are valued. But absent those things, what can individuals do to hopefully be nudged to make more adaptive attributions in the face of ambiguity? And that's what this training does, is identify those moments of critical ambiguity where people might make negative attributions, where I might wonder, am I smart enough? Do I belong, and does it matter? These are the kind of core questions that students ask whenever they're faced with a difficulty. And the program that we've developed is specifically intended to provide more adaptive attributions to those questions. So that's a great point.
As far as fostering those adaptive mindsets, you know, how would an educator go about fostering that in, let's say, an online environment?
So with online environments, it's no different than the traditional classrooms in that the core goal is to allow students, to allow individuals to internalize an identity as a learner. There are limitations with online environments because of the distance between the social groups that allows you to sort of connect like you would in a traditional classroom. So there's a few more barriers, but there's also a few more safeguards because there's less evaluation, there's less comparison, there's less downward sort of feelings of inadequacy, right? Because you're not sitting next to the person next to you who's showing you their A, and you're like, okay, well, that I don't feel too bad. So you have less comparison happening. But the core essence is the same, is how do we create programs, structures, resources, and experiences that allow students to really accept and see themselves as learners in any context. And again, with a sensitivity to when might those moments be when students might ask themselves these core questions of, can I do this? Do I belong and does it matter? So that you can sort of offset those moments and make sure that you provide clarity for having more adaptive explanations for that.
Yeah, you've touched a lot on the social aspect of learning, which evolutionarily speaking, social learning is a huge part to how we learn. And I feel like some of the way in which our higher education system is structured in the classroom, both online and in a traditional classroom setting, can kind of take away that social learning component. So some of those areas that you touched on, those key moments of kind of doubt that a student may have, am I smart enough to, master this content? Am I learning things effectively? Where am I at? Those social comparisons. I think some of that may arise or kind of be kind of pigeonholed into those negative areas because there's not that social support network. I mean, what happens in a traditional university is you sign up for classes. You may not know anyone, especially if you're, go to an out-of-state college, or you may only know a few people. They may be in different programs, your friends. And you sign up and you show up to a classroom with 100 strangers. And if you're struggling, you don't have anyone to turn to. That social support's not there. So I think we can foster these kind of social support networks to help students in those key moments to be able to move those moments of vulnerabilities into a positive kind of reframing of the situation, and decrease the likelihood that we go into a negative, attribution and a negative personal attribution. And within an online environment, this may look a little bit different because we don't have kind of those group of people right around us. But I think in an online environment, you can still kind of foster those community spaces where students can lean on one another and form that social network to help make those cognitive reframings a little bit more positive in those key moments where students may feel like they're struggling and may be more likely in a traditional setting to move into a more negative attribution.
Yeah.
So I think a social component's a big key piece to these kind of adaptive, positive mindsets that you're speaking of.
Yeah, no, and I love that example as well, because again, the core mission of this particular training is again sort of honing in on those moments of ambiguity, where people in any particular context might be more likely to make negative attributions, all things being equal. And certainly I think you and I will not disagree on the fact that there's a critical importance in making sure that there are structures and systems in place, including social structures, that creates and sustains motivation. Like, we are social creatures. We're not going to do any kind of endeavor without having the social reinforcements, without having the validation of feeling like we're a worthy member of that group. But what's interesting, again, is the potential little moments of ambiguity where this program tries to hone in on. So you talked about, the kinds of factors that might predict persistence and resilience and being able to sustain and stay engaged. One example of the program that we talk about is some of the misperceptions or the myths around what these experiences ought to mean, right? Because again, we take it for granted that our culture, just because we are social creatures, imbues certain meaning to certain events. And so if we're in a classroom and the instructor is speaking with me, then I take that to mean a certain thing, that they're there because they're paid, because they care about my learning, and that my role in that class is to be an attentive and curious learner. But there's a lot of things that we take for granted as well, that there's a whole bunch of us sitting in this class, that maybe some people may or may not be sort of as focused as we are. And that also, to the next level is really like, what are the other people's motivations and what are their qualities, what are their characteristics, what are their personality traits. And so the essence of this training is to figure out the elements that sometimes we take for granted as being sort of true facts, but really are malleable. They're open for sort of a reattribution that gives us a better competitive edge. And when we're talking about resilience and persistence and engagement, a notion that I like to focus on a lot is this notion that's kind of gained a lot of popularity in recent years, is this notion of grit. I think there's, in popular, our culture is that it's adaptive to be gritty and to sort of, when you have nothing left to give, find a little bit more, to sort of, pick yourself by the bootstraps and kind of like, grind it out. But to your point about us being social learners, when you actually observe grittiness and resilience, you find that resilience is more of a quality of the network that you have as opposed to a characteristic of the individual. And why that's important is because when you have nothing left to give, you're going to rely on the people who are around you to sort of pull you up, to sort of help you get through things. And if you recognize that distinction, albeit unspoken, that there is a distinction between effective and adaptive resilience versus this notion that grinding and grit is a valuable trait, then maybe you can sort of choose in those moments when you are tired, when you have had negative feedback, about whether you're going to sort of lock yourself up in your dorm and try to study a little bit more in the middle of the night, throughout the night, or do you reach out and talk to a professor, or maybe study in a peer group, maybe almost also preemptively invest in resilient networks, like create study groups and friendships, knowing that later when you want to be able to be more resilient, that you have this resource to fall back on. So again, this training tries to capture these little sort of unspoken notions that we have, and nudges people to sort of understand the more adaptive kinds of attributions and strategies that helps them succeed. Yeah.
So if you don't mind, I'd like to switch gears here.
Sure.
We've talked about some of the social dynamics and applications in the classroom, but what is the base of research for this work? And Nicole, I know you've done some work combing into mindset research, and what are your thoughts on it? And then Omid, if you could share yours as well.
Yeah. So I'm a little bit more new to kind of the growth mindset research area. I've been kind of passively observing it for a little while now, and my observations are that growth mindset interventions, or growth mindset, just kind of that perspective that you have on your abilities as a person in a kind of higher education context, seem to be most applicable for students that are struggling, kind of the students that we really want to help in higher education. So typically the students are in the front row, have their hand up every question, and are at the 8 a.m. classes ready to go. Typically don't need as much of that extra push and strategies, although they can still probably benefit from them. But from my reading of the literature, which Omid you can speak on more directly, but it seems to be that these interventions are really useful for students that we definitely want to kind of help in that higher education context. So students that may be performing below average, or students that maybe are first generation students that don't have maybe those social support networks or those kind of supportive peer norms around. And that was something in one of the most recent randomized trials that came out, was those supportive peer networks are really useful, which ties into what we were talking about before with those social networks. So my view is that in the literature that these interventions or these skill sets that we can help teach students are really effective for the students that really do need the most help, and that educators are usually trying to target the most for these interventions.
Great.
Yeah.
And Omid, what research are you basing this work on, this training program?
So the basis for the adaptive mindsets training is really at its core recognizing that there are recursive processes that are very different from the traditional approach of giving people information or asking them to change their behaviors, which has more of a limited impact. The core of the adaptive mindsets training is recognizing that there are recursive processes that are initiated when you change how someone views a potential negative or ambiguous event. If I get a D in a math class, I could take that D to be evidence that I'm not smart enough, that I'm an admissions error, and that I shouldn't be here in the first place. If I have that belief in response to that D grade, I'm also less likely to go and speak with my professor during office hours, or to ask a peer if they want to study together, which in turn means that I probably won't do as well on the next test. And in turn, it confirms my initial concern that I'm not smart enough to be here. Now, if in response to that same D, I instead make the attribution that I probably didn't study the right sections, and maybe I should go and speak with my professor, or try to figure out what I did wrong by talking to my friends, and stay away from these internal fixed attributions that sometimes people make, then I'm also more likely to do better on that next test, which in turn reinforces my more adaptive perception and explanation for that D. So in these moments of ambiguity, or in the face of challenge or difficulty, we're left with these questions. And if we offer a training that targets those moments by providing more adaptive attributions, then we can initiate these recursive processes that really are more sustainable. That's at the heart of what we focused on in this training, is figuring out what are, again, these moments of ambiguity that can be targeted, that can be sort of trained so that people can be more vigilant for moments when they might be prone to make these negative attributions, when they might fall prey to the negative stereotypes or their cultural perspectives around what the meaning of these negative things are. You're not a failure if you get a D. It's part of the learning process. And yet somehow we've accepted these perceptions that failure, struggle, difficulty, even trying to learn fast. A lot of students report that I speak with that if learning takes too long, they think it means that they're not smart enough. So these sort of unspoken things that loom large in the air are things that can be trained for students to recognize that there are more adaptive ways to engage with these challenges and difficulties. And part of the training also helps to highlight two things. One is that we're typically not very good at predicting the influence of the context on our decisions and our behaviors and our emotions. We take it for granted that the social context or the environmental influences impacts how we actually feel and think. Some of the classic studies on the bystander effect are a really good example of this. So you take a group of participants or individuals, you put them in a room, much like this one, and you have a few people in the room. And while they're waiting for presumably the study to start, the researcher will start pumping smoke into this room. And what's funny is that the participant who's sitting here usually will not do anything if they perceive no one else is doing anything. And even though they're starting to cough, even though the room is filling up with smoke, they won't even voice the recognition that this room is filled with smoke, because when they look around and they see these other people who are Confederates, there's basically hired actors to sit there and not do anything, the individual will override their own reactions, their own beliefs, and instead will rely on the information and the context. So we're traditionally not very good at recognizing the influence of the context on our own outcomes. And the other is that we're also just not very good at being able to predict how we will feel in the future or in different contexts. Part of the basis for that bias is that we're also not very good at understanding time. So I love time because it's one of those concepts that's entirely theoretical. Like if I were to ask you what time it is, your watch and my watch will usually tell the same time, but it's completely an artifact of what we've constructed. We have agreed through cultural norms that there are 12 hours in a day and so on and so forth. And we also think that time is something that we all sort of see and interact with in the same way, but it's not true. And because it's an entirely mental construct, it's prone to bias. And we're not good at picking up our own biases. And the bias with time is that we have this tendency of seeing the past and the future in different ways. So if I were to ask you 10 years ago, what were your preferences and what kinds of food did you like and who did you hang out with, chances are you would recognize that who you are today has shifted and evolved dramatically from who you were 10, 15, 20 years ago. And yet when we ask people to project themselves into the future, they somehow take the image of themselves and they paste it at every transition in their lives as though they will continue to have the same preferences, the same look, the same feelings and reactions to all of the events that will happen to them. And why that's potentially harmful for students is if they get a bad grade, for instance, the emotion that comes on for that bad grade gets accentuated because now they think this feeling will last forever because of this bias of time. So there's a lot of sort of factors and these elements that we target that help to overcome these two dimensions. One is the impact of the context, and one is these sort of biases that we're blind to that often impact our decisions and our performance.
Omid, you were talking about this fixed self-view. Nicole, with your experience in human development, what does this mean for older students, non-traditional students? You know, the typical WGU student or average WGU student is in their 30s. They're not your traditional student. So how does this apply to learners of all ages?
It's a great question. And I think as people get older, as we go through our life, we start to develop more stable self-views based on our experiences, based on those reinforcement and feedback loops over time. And typically what research shows is that who we are and that self-view and that personality of kind of what makes us unique begins to stabilize as individuals get older. So one thing with these kind of adaptive mindsets is that it may be more difficult to change these adaptive mindsets, or more effort needs to be put in to change and break these reinforcement cycles or these images of ourselves that have been built up over time. So for my reading of the research, it looks like that these growth mindset interventions seem to be decreasing in effectiveness as individuals get older. So they can be super effective, especially for like primary and secondary students. And then as we work through the traditional college student all the way up into the non-traditional college student, it may take a little bit more kind of holistic effort or more broader adaptive skills. So I feel like this training can be much more applicable to older students because it covers so many different areas rather than a traditional just kind of one-off, maybe 30-minute intervention. This will cover a lot of different skills and can cover changes across a variety of domains that can have a positive impact on older non-traditional students. So I think as we move forward through our life, we need to take a more holistic approach, a broader approach to come up with these different interventions that can hit on more areas rather than one specific area to promote that positive change and kind of shift our mindset in a more positive, productive direction. And do you have any thoughts on kind of how we can change these things for older versus younger students?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, as you mentioned, as we grow up, which I hear is fun. Maybe one day I'll try it. I'm not sure. We do have more of a stable identity because we've had more time to basically categorize the dimensions that we think belong to our sense of core self and the ones that we sort of cast out. So once we've decided something is no longer part of my umbrella of identity domains, then it's kind of harder to bring that back in. That being said, there are ways that we can use this training to shatter the basis for the exclusion. And that's what we hope to do. There is a way of kind of targeting these core assumptions that really does fundamentally shift the way they start to engage with repeated events that become self-sustaining. So to your point around the notion of age and intelligence, or age and learning, there is this maladaptive belief, which is normally sort of unquestioned, that as you get older, that learning becomes more difficult. Now, I'm not a neurological psychologist, nor do I want to get into the debate of how the brain evolves and changes over time. But I will say that there's also a component that has an influence on how you engage with learning based on how much you buy into that belief. Their beliefs about their innate ability to become smarter impacts how they engage or disengage. So if I have that belief that I'm older, which I am, and I am given something to learn, and I look around and I see nothing but younger kids who are sort of seemingly doing really well effortlessly, then I'm left with a question of maybe there's something about my age that is the reason why I feel anxious. That's the reason why I feel like this is hard. And hopefully what this training can do is, in that moment of questioning, provide an alternative to why they think this is difficult. So we try to inject these alternative interpretations in these moments of ambiguity so that absent any other explanation, at least they have this one to say, well, maybe it's possible that it's just my belief about intelligence. Maybe I'm going to delay or postpone this interpretation for now. And instead of getting up from my desk and going and doing something else, I'm going to focus 10 more minutes. And maybe that 10 more minutes is just enough to get a little bit better of a score on the test, which in turn, again, reinforces the initial belief that sticking it out and persisting and enduring the negative experience of learning is more adaptive. The other thing that I'll mention really quickly, which is at the core of learning, is this misperception of what learning ought to feel like. So a lot of the times I get asked the question of what is intelligence? Like, how do you become smart? Well, it turns out that being smart means putting yourself at the frontiers of your ability. And what that means is being in that place where you don't yet know something, being in that place where you might raise your hand and say something foolish or make a mistake, and being okay with being uncertain, with being kind of uncomfortable. That's where we ask students and ourselves to live when we want to have an optimal learning experience. And so the people who are able to be the smartest are the ones who can stay in that space the longest. They're the ones who can actually ask questions more and seek out the resources so that they can learn in an optimal way, because they don't make the meaning of that uncertainty to mean that they're not smart enough, that they can't do it. So within those moments of ambiguity, of uncertainty, the explanations we come up with have a tremendous impact on whether we engage and disengage. And this narrative around maybe it's people like me or people of my age or people of my background or people of my gender these are convenient explanations that help you disengage when things are hard. And so if we target those and provide more adaptive attributions and narratives and strategies, then people are able to persist just long enough to hopefully initiate this recursive process.
Yeah, you touch on the way in which someone's age, for example, like a non-traditional student, may, especially in a setting where there's, in a traditional college setting where we have a lot of, fresh out of high school students, they may think that, oh, maybe this is more difficult because of my age. But we could kind of switch that perspective, in that moment of ambiguity that you touch on, to be like, well, I actually have more experience. I can reframe this in a positive way, that I have more knowledge and experience to draw on to maybe connect these new concepts, or individuals that have non-traditional students, they have more experience. They may have more comfortable ability to be in that kind of uncertain space or that new frontier of their abilities because they've been there before. So it's something that perhaps individuals that are coming back to school after being out of school for a while may feel uncomfortable because it is a new kind of domain that they're in. It is hard. Learning isn't always easy. It usually shouldn't be easy if you're pushing your boundaries. But a non-traditional student, we can reframe that uncertainty or that ambiguity about, oh, is it my age that's making this hard?
Right.
Rather than, kind of reframe that into, well, learning's hard. If you're pushing yourself, if you're moving beyond, your current abilities, it is an uncomfortable space. It is a hard space. But we can hopefully help students in a non-traditional setting reframe that ability of drawing on that life experience. This is a positive thing that I have this life experience. And in my experience as an instructor, I find that the non-traditional students are much more willing to raise their hand, be engaged in class, because they have that experience. They've been in situations before where something is new and uncomfortable that a traditional college student may not have in that setting. So I think we can, especially for a traditional WGU student that's typically older than in their 20-year-old average state school college student, that we could reframe and draw on that life experience as a really positive thing for promoting that learning experience in a really adaptive way.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Omid, Nicole. Really appreciate your thoughts. I'm Ashley Pallarito. For more information on adaptive mindsets, please visit us at wgulabs.org.